an honour to invite her to give an address to society. I hope you will enjoy it.
Just come on. See, the last day of term. Go ahead. You're in grade 4, aren't you? Well, for another 2 weeks anyway. How long does the reading period last? Is it 2 weeks? Before the exams set in. Listen, it's wonderful. Thank you so many of you. Thank you for being here on what is the last day. You could be in all sorts of other places. And I'm very grateful that you're here. I'm also very, very grateful to the Literary and Debating Society for honouring me with the President's Medal. It means a lot. And in particular to have it awarded in the context of the peace and the peace building that really characterises the work of this generation and sort of a generation, 2 generations really, most of them still alive happily on this island, who have really cut the umbilical cord in many ways to a rather baleful history. Martin and I are both delighted to be here because it was through our respective, we first met through debating. That's how we met. Be warned. Yeah, it's not all good news, this debating, you know. We first met in Belfast over 40 years ago. Do not do the maths. So debating societies have a very, very special place in our hearts. But Martin will also concede that even in those days, I generally walked away with the medal. So today is no different. But actually, it's a little bit different. It's very, very special this day. I'm actually very relieved that I didn't have to compete to get this medal. In many ways, actually, this award, particularly with the emphasis on peace building and peacemaking, it brings us back, brings Martin and I right back to our student days, those days of the late 1960s, because those days marked for us the start of our adulthood and also, regrettably, the start of what we call the Troubles. And it was the beginning for both of us, and for many others indeed, of a time of very deep, enduring, personal debate about how we should respond to what was going on in the world around us. And I just don't mean the broad world around us, I mean right on our own doorsteps, to the developing violence that was everywhere, the historic causes that everybody was arguing over, the culture of sectarian and political conflict that we had both grown up with. We had inherited it, neither of us had created it, but how to become someone who wasn't going to be a conduit, because after all, the conduit from generation to generation wasn't just the history books, it was people. People, how they talked to each other, related to each other, what they told their children, how they dealt with one another. How did we stop the toxin in our lives? How did we stop ourselves from becoming conduits in our turn? The violence was encountered very painfully, very directly in both our lives. We lived with it. We didn't live adjacent to it, regrettably, or removed from it, but rather completely enveloped by it, and at times swept by it, swept up by it. And it challenged our values, it challenged our beliefs, it challenged our principles. It made us stop and wonder, what are those things that we are choosing to live by? These things were no longer just theoretical issues, but rather things that we had to make up our minds pretty much on the hoof by. The ambitions we had for ourselves, what were they? What were the ambitions we had for our country? What was our identity? How important was that identity to us? What were its characteristics? And those things distilled in both of us, out of our direct experience, it instilled in both of us an unwavering abhorrence of violence, of injustice, of oppression, of social inequality. And it forged a very strong determination to do whatever we could in our own way, in our own lives, to make things better, if we could. The social demography of Northern Ireland is dominated by religiously dominated ghettos. It still is, even today, though things are considerably better, thankfully, it still is. 93% of all people who live in Northern Ireland, they live in areas that are characterised by the fact that they are either Protestant, Catholic, Loyalist, Republican, Unionist, Nationalist, and rarely mixed. In middle class areas, yes, you will get mixing, but they're the other 7%. The vast majority of people live then and continue to live in areas that are very, very largely segregated. That was, in a way, where Martin and I were fortunate. We did not live in those kind of areas. We were exceptions to the rule. We both grew up, though we grew up in different parts of Belfast, but we grew up largely in Protestant areas. In my own case, we were the only Catholic family in the street that I grew up in. In Martin's case, not too dissimilar. Very, very similar. Martin grew up in a Loyalist area in East Belfast. I grew up in a Loyalist area in North Belfast. So despite separate schooling and separate churches, we, among our neighbours, we grew up with very good Protestant friends, very good Protestant neighbours, and so we knew from first principles the goodness that existed and the decency that existed in the hearts of both sides, but we also knew from first principles the really ridiculously dangerous estrangement, the astonishing capacity that both sides had to live what looked like cheek by jowl with one another, and yet to live in complete ignorance of one another. Worse than ignorance, to live presuming that we actually knew what the other thought, and we knew enough about it to be contemptuous of it. So I don't need to rehearse to any of you the baleful consequences of that estrangement, except to say that the troubles I lived through were not that different from the troubles that my father and mother would have lived through in a different generation, or that my grandparents lived through in another generation, because similar outcroppings of political sectarian violence had recurred for generations. Ours was just the latest. In fact, since the foundation of this society back in famine Ireland in 1846, the archives of history will chronicle regular episodes of political sectarian violence, evidence of a deeply fractured country and unreconciled people who physically shared a place, physically shared an island, but actually didn't share a whole lot else. And integration of planter and Gael is still pretty much a work in progress, even 400 years later. Actually, one of the things that the older I get that scares me most is how toxic attitudes have the most remarkable long shelf life. Extraordinary. Extraordinary, and never, ever, ever think they're over. It's the same with sexism, sectarianism, racism. Any of those isms, they have the most remarkable shelf life. And just when you think you have them, you have them snared, they have a capacity to jump, like a fire. They can jump the break that you have worked hard to make, and the next thing they have created another forest fire somewhere else. So this society came into existence at a time when there were a lot of forest fires in this country, as a result of many of those toxins at work. This society came into existence during those dreadful years of the famine, shortly before the death of the best orator, the best debater of them all, Daniel O'Connell, the man who tried valiantly to persuade the majority, the people of his generation, the majority of whom lived completely disempowered lives under elitist minority control, but he tried to channel their righteous indignation and righteous frustration into dialogue, into constitutional debate, into standing for election, into making your point by use of your voice, use of words, powers of persuasion. And he died, of course, not probably in his own mind, regarding himself as something of a failure in that regard, despite his great success with Catholic emancipation and his championing of so many other causes worldwide, whether it was Russian Jews or whether it was American Indians. But he died broken in spirit completely, of course, by the famine. And looking at the world of his time, he would have, I think, have had cause to believe that the gravitational pull of those toxins that I mentioned, and the way in which they can, in a very weaselly way, conduce to violence, he would have thought that the gravitational pull had really won out against his powers of persuasion against his view that there was a better way always, a more humanly decent way to resolve problems than to resort to violence. And for me, this generation's greatest success has been the way in which, all these years later, it has vindicated O'Connell's ambition, vindicated and justified his view that debate works, that dialogue works, that persuasion actually works, that democracy works, that the game-changing he could see through persuasion actually does work. And now, in this moment that we're in, with so many economic worries, so much disappointment, righteous disappointment, consuming minds and hearts, so much of a sense that the gravitational pull is dragging us away from creativity and positivity, I think it's very important that we acknowledge the way in which the genius of this generation has given us a gift that absolutely just eluded every other generation, and that is the gift of this peace that we have. This peace process, I won't call it a finished peace, it's far from that, it's a work in progress. You cannot turn the tide of history, of hundreds of years of history, just in one generation. You can put it on the turn, you can take it to the cusp, but then you rely on every generation after that to take responsibility for making sure that the direction stays in the right direction, that the impetus and momentum stays in the right direction. And we've seen in this generation the remarkable transformation, as you've mentioned, of relationships within Northern Ireland, between the two traditions, the two communities. We've actually seen and felt for the first time not that the two traditions have merged, not that they have changed their perspective, both with their independent, very independent take and perspective on life and their different ambitions, one to remain within the United Kingdom, one for United Ireland, but both of those ambitions now parked safely in a managed and a very well managed way in the Good Friday Agreement. But we've seen how the two traditions, faced now with incidences of violence that are designed to give that gravitational pull, the oomph to drag us all back to violence, we've actually seen the beginnings of a ferocious communal solidarity around the peace. Now, that solidarity doesn't mean that those who were unionists have become nationalists, those who were nationalists have become unionists. It means they have become peacemakers, peace builders. It means they have a shared common focus on the future that is big enough and wide enough to hold all their views in tension together, but not necessarily to abandon all forms of disagreement. And that's a huge change between now and the era when Martin and I were sitting where you were, looking forward to exams in 2 weeks' time with the kind of enthusiasm that I can see written all over your faces right now. And so we've seen the transformation of those relationships within Northern Ireland, and it is a formidable transformation. We've seen a remarkable transformation of relationships cross-border. The amount of dialogue, discussion, partnership, collegiality, collaboration cross-border in the last 10 years leaves everything that happened for the previous 40 or 50 or even 450 years, it leaves that all standing. Certainly right back to the foundation of this state, we have never seen anything like the coursing and generous kind of collegiality that is emerging and has emerged these past few years since the Good Friday Agreement. And indeed, of course, one of the most fundamental changes that we have seen, the one that was crucial to the creation of the peace process, was the changed relationship between Ireland and Great Britain, Ireland and the United Kingdom, a very characteristically historically fraught relationship, one that was tended to break down relatively easily, particularly where issues to do with Ireland were concerned, now characterised by strong warmth, friendship, collegiality, some of it, of course, driven by our experience of membership of the European Union, where people got to know each other, generations of politicians worked together closely, got to like each other, had a common focus, began to work well together. And so things